Xhanti, thank you for your time. So 1.2% quarter on quarter in terms of the growth. This is the fourth consecutive quarter of growth. Is it something that we should be heaving a sigh of relief, or are we coming off a very low base and the structural issues that we've had all along remain, and therefore nothing for us to write home about?
Good afternoon, and good afternoon to the viewers. I think it's important to really recognize, of course, that it is not something that we want to write home about. I think the interesting part here is to see which sectors have actually improved. I think the first interesting bit there is what we call personal services, and those services include things like doctors, hospitals, psychologists, and some of those services that actually make a lot of sense in terms of what we've been going through as a society, right? Because we are in a pandemic. So of course, many of us have been going to hospital, have been using doctors, and all of those things. So that is really, I suspect, one of the key things that actually has been communicated here. Then of course, transport is probably giving us a little bit of a sense that we are starting, to recover. So we are not actually talking about here going into the major changes in terms of investment, for example, because you can see that, and I think I quite agree with your colleague when he says we need a lot more investment. We are not seeing that, and that is actually right in the number of fixed investment that would actually help us to create jobs. But I think it's an important thing to also consider that the economy is changing. You were talking earlier about the revised the revised GDP that we are now working from at the rebased. And I thought that the interesting part about that was that we've seen, in manufacturing, looking like it has increased over this 10-year period. But in terms of jobs, we are not seeing the jobs being created in the manufacturing sector. Actually, jobs are being lost consistently. So while we may want, higher GDP, we have to be very serious and careful about where this is going to come from and how the structure of the economy itself is actually changing. And I think those numbers have been clearer in terms of, for example, the construction sector. That's a sector we know creates a lot of jobs, but we know that that sector still is holding back. But also it depends on manufacturing, where we manufacture bricks, for example, and there should be jobs that have been created. So the structure of the economy is changing and has changed for forever. And we now need to recognize that we can't use the same analysis we've been using all along.
Xhanti, Devin Murugan here. Let me put this to you while you're talking about jobs. We had one analyst say just 2 weeks ago, when we had those dreadful jobless figures, saying that 600,000 jobs need to be created a year just to stabilize the unemployment rate in this country. Never mind reverse it. Now, if you have a growth rate that we are seeing at the moment in the long term, you have a complete non-alignment between the number of people that are coming onto the job market and the way in which this economy is growing. And again, I take it out of this period of the second quarter. In a sustained way, we're just not growing to satisfy the need of workers in this country, aren't we? In fact, the gap is phenomenal.
The gap is phenomenal, but I think that there are two parts to this discussion, and I think it's very important that we have to change our minds about this. Whether or not it's actually employment follows growth, or actually we need to get people employed, and that will create the growth that we need. And one of the key things has been actually their orientation that comes from the growth, therefore will trickle down into jobs, and that is not being seen. This is the point I'm trying to make about, you can see, for example, the economy has been growing, you can see the growth in the manufacturing sector, but jobs being lost in that same manufacturing sector. And therefore, what we're actually talking about now is how we actually think about how do we actually make sure that people are engaged in the right kinds of activities that actually create growth, that actually, that means that they are getting paid, for example. So one of the key things that we are now seeing is exactly that you can find, for example, if you look at, and I wrote about this in the Financial Mail last week, that one of the things we've noticed is that if you are looking at the manufacturing sector that's growing, and then many people have said, for example, the construction sector, and this is in the research, hires a lot of people. So the construction sector has a multiplier for 4 times, for example. So for every million rand you invest in the construction sector, you can actually get about 4 jobs. Now, the problem is that actually that also included, for example, people that manufacture the bricks that are used in the manufacturing sector. But we are now learning that one of the things that are happening in the bricks manufacturing sector is that actually that is being automated. So those jobs are being lost. So we're starting to see that change of structure that is happening. We know that automation is a very, very big thing. We know, the robotics are a very big thing that is coming at us. So how do we make sure that actually we don't just focus on growth, but we focus on how we actually deliver that growth? What kinds of sectors actually are going to allow us to actually still hire more people? And those sectors are sectors like agriculture, even though there is still automation. Tourism is a big one, right? Because we are not going to automate anytime soon in terms of actually tour guides, for example, or hotel workers that, even though we are starting to see robots working in hotels. So what is important is really, really to start to think about this thing in a different way so that we can see that as the world is changing, as people are now starting to work more from home, and so we don't need a lot of people supporting offices, cleaning offices, we don't need a lot of people managing office spaces. How do we make sure that actually we are now targeting the new world that we are approaching and how we can create employment, and therefore our growth actually comes from people actively working rather than machines acting and working.
Lastly then from me, Xhanti, you will have seen the statements coming out of the ANC's National Executive Committee, Lekgotla, talking about the policy interventions that need to happen to boost economic growth. Given what we have, 4 quarters of growth but nothing to write home about, and the last decade or so we averaged some 2%. What's your sense then, this conversation about more need for a social wage and support for people in the form of temporary grants or in the broader context of a basic income grant going forward in a sustainable way? Is this a conversation where we have no choice but to look at, given the realities that we face?
Yes, I think definitely in terms of social solidarity, there's no doubt that for those who have, we've got to try and support those who don't have. And I think that's, the basic income grant says, let's find the money within those who are working the taxes and try and support those who don't. But it also suggests something that starts to, should worry us, that we are struggling to actually bring as many people as we should into being working. Instead, we are actually trying to help them, with sort of, with solidarity. One of the key things that the said that actually got me very worried. As I mentioned earlier, the future of work is changing. We are using more robots, we're using technology, we're using, as we are talking now, on an ordinary day, of course, I would have had to drive to Hyde Park. Now, what that is telling us is actually that we need, and he talked about spectrum. And the tone that he used around spectrum, which is a key ingredient that we're going to need to create more, to include people into work, especially young people, in terms of the new jobs that are and work activity, was that he said, he'd like to call on people who are involved in spectrum. So there's a sort of an attitude there that seems to me that concerns me around actually how the big inputs in this world, in this country, the government is not able to actually control and enforce. And we've been talking about spectrum for a very long time. So that gives me a sense that we know the key things that have to be done, and it seems that we are not able to move the levers that will deliver those things, such as spectrum, so that we can actually bring in more young people, and that actually we are not so dependent on a national minimum wage. And of course, the kind of legislation and support that is necessary to make sure that people have the kind of work that earns them decent salaries, that actually, are retrieving what they are contributing to the economy. So those are the kinds of things we need to do, but we need to change our minds about the long-standing discussion that we've been having about which one comes first. Is it growth or is it employment? Growth is very important because it's what gets people attracted to the country, right? So that they can come and invest here. But it's not the same thing that in itself can create work. We need to change that kind of thinking. But more than anything else, we need to recognize the world of work is changing, the way we work is changing, and therefore we need to act quickly to make sure that actually we are structuring the economy in such a way.
Lucid, crystal clear analysis there, Devon, from Payi. So it sets the scene then nicely for the new finance minister, Enoch Godongwana, ahead of the medium-term budget policy statement. He's got his work cut out for him.
Yeah, indeed. And he was very vocal about the fact that while he's not throwing out the basic income grant, he says that if we do not get young people in this country into work and becoming less dependent, we're going to have a problem. It will be interesting to see what he says.
All right, thank you for that. ENCA business editor, that is Devon Murugan, and Payi there, helping us make sense of the GDP figures just came out now for the second quarter of this year.